Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we're going to be talking about history. And we're going to be talking about the history of the Holocaust, specifically in Lithuania, with two different activists and authors, Silvia Foti, who has recently written the book, The Nazis' Granddaughter, which was published in 2021, and Gochin, who is an activist and also descended from Lithuanians. Welcome both of you to the show. I want to welcome too Megan Ferenczy, who is with the Virginia Holocaust Museum based in Richmond. And Megan's going to describe to you an event that's coming up in May where Silvia and Grant are going to talk more in depth about their efforts to bring the truth out about what happened to the Jewish population in Lithuania during World War II. So, Megan, give us a little background on this particular educational program, since you oversee the educational program.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. So on May 5th, we're going to be hosting a program with Silvia and Grant. I'll be there as well. And they're going to be talking about Silvia's going to be talking about her book, how she uncovered family history, right, that relates to the Holocaust. Grant's going to be talking about his connection, not only to Silvia and her family, but then they're going to be talking about activism and kind of where this uncovering of two families' histories, has led to trying to make sure the truth comes out in regards to Holocaust history. It should be a fascinating discussion. And I think too, right now, with the conversations we're having with history and talking about uncomfortable history, and instead of sweeping something like that under the carpet, that we're going to lean into that and maybe uncomfortable and to really shine a light on that and to talk about it. So that conversation, again, is on May 5th. And it is online on Zoom, and it's free. But you need to register, but it would be great if people could join us that night.
So how did you discover Silvia's book? I mean, how did this whole thing come to your attention, Megan?
So I actually received an email. As the director of education, I get many emails from authors, people that have created films about the Holocaust. And, we only have so much time during the year to be able to put those on. And sometimes I'll have to pass, or we'll have to, make the program like a year later, just because there isn't enough time. But Silvia sent an email, and what really jumped out to me was that her grandfather, finding out that her grandfather was a Nazi, a perpetrator. You don't hear about that often, and writing about that discovery that is pretty recent, right? And we have a connection actually to Lithuania at this museum. So the founder, Jay Ibsen, his family is from Lithuania, and parts of our exhibits are focused on that as well. And we talk about that through our programming and tours of people that we bring through the museum about Lithuania and Lithuanians' complicity during the Holocaust, and the collaboration and how that affected not only Jay, the founder of the museum's family, but other Jewish Lithuanians as well. So there's that connection. And then I think too, just the conversations that we've been having for many years and that really have been amplified over the past 2 years about talking about difficult histories, right? Even here in Richmond, we're having those conversations about the Civil War. And talking about those things is uncomfortable, right? Talking about dark history is uncomfortable. But I think it's important, again, to not sweep those things under the rug, but to really bring those out in the open, shine a light on that, have dialogues and conversations about that.
So, Silvia, I read your book, and it is fascinating because, as Megan points out, you discovered that your grandfather, he is revered. He is a Lithuanian national hero. And you were brought up to revere him your whole life. Your mother intended to write this book, and after decades of 40 years of research, she actually never wrote a word, but asked you as she was passing to please write this book. And tragically, your grandmother died 5 months later. So your research took you from the year 2000 up until the publication of your Salon article, I guess, in 2018. And Grant, you published a book in 2013 and proceeded to sue the Lithuanian government for distorting the history and actually recognizing Silvia's grandfather as a national hero. So here the two of you are coming at the same subject and actually reaching the same conclusions, and yet each of you, your families were on the opposing sides of the Holocaust in Lithuania. So Silvia, let's start with, the background on how you finally decided to pursue this once you realized that the man you thought you knew really wasn't who you thought he was.
It started with the deathbed promise to my mother, who asked me to write this book about her father. And at the time, this was the year 2000, I was 38 years old then. I was a full-time journalist. And I thought I was going to write a wonderful story about a World War II hero who fought very bravely against the communists. And, I thought it would be a rather small story, family story. I thought Lithuanians would love it, and I thought that would be it. But within months, my mom died in February 2000, and she wanted to be buried in Lithuania. And by October 2000, we decided to bring her remains there, along with my grandmother's. My grandmother died 5 months after her. And it was at the school. We were visiting the school named after my grandfather, the Jonas Grammar School. And I was talking to the director of the school about the name. And I asked him, how did you decide to name the school after my grandfather? And he said, before we had a Russian name, because Lithuania was occupied by the Soviet Union for 50 years after World War II until 1990. And he said, we had this horrible Russian name, and we wanted to get a good patriotic Lithuanian name, and your grandfather was born here, and he's such a magnificent hero that we decided to name the school after him. And I thought that would be the end of the story. But that's when he pulls me aside and he says, but we got a lot of grief over naming the school after your grandfather. And I said, grief from who? And I was very, very naive at the time. And he said, from the Jews. And I'm like, what could the Jews possibly say about my wonderful, magnificent grandfather? I could not even understand the connection to it. And he looked at me like I was the idiot, because apparently it's common knowledge and an open secret. And I apparently was the last one on the planet who did not know this. And he said, your grandfather was accused of killing Jews. And, that was like a punch in the gut to me, because that was the very, very first time I had ever heard anything like this. And I was completely unprepared for it. And I'm standing in the school named after my grandfather, arguably the biggest monument to him. I'm a school teacher now. I'm a high school teacher. So I really understand the significance of schools and what they can do to children and how important they are. And it's, naming a school after someone, to me, it's even bigger than a statue, because it's a living monument where thousands of children go through that monument day after day, year after year, decade after decade. And they are taught. And when you're in a school named after someone, you definitely know what this person stands for and what they do. So it was just very ironic that I heard this the first time I heard this in the school named after my grandfather. So anyway, I come back to Chicago And I talked to my father and other members of the Lithuanian community, and I'm like, have you ever heard this crazy story about Jonas Koreika and this rumor of him killing Jews? And to my shock, they all said, yeah, I heard it. And I'm like, why didn't anybody tell me about this? And they said, well, it's not true. It's just communist propaganda. The communists don't want Lithuania to have any heroes. And they're just making this up to hurt Lithuania. And it's just communist propaganda. So it's not true. So there's nothing to believe, and you don't need to write about it. And having grown up in Chicago, being a Lithuanian in Chicago, that's kind of what I thought. I agreed with everybody initially. But it took me many years to get over my denial. And once I finally got over the denial, I started really looking into the Nazi occupation in Lithuania, which was 3 years. You know, Lithuania was occupied by the Soviets for like 50 years. So Lithuanians in general tend to focus on the Soviet occupation. And there's very little on the Nazi occupation. So I decided to focus on the Nazi occupation because as a journalist, this was kind of the new territory to get into. And to my shock, I found document after document with my grandfather's signature or name on it. And it had to do with hating Jews. It had to do with putting Jews in a ghetto. It had to do with appropriating their property. It had to do with marginalizing them, boycotting them. So it was just, as I compiled these documents one after another, it was so bad that even me, as his granddaughter, I just could not stay in the denial. So that's how I shifted gears and really kind of moved into this and wanted to see what was going on.
Well, in your book, you take us along with you because you're uncovering a lot of this in the summer of 2013. And, you know, you talk to relatives who were alive in that period, and you're running across all these documents that are adding up to a really terrible picture. Miles and miles away, Grant, in 2013, published a book on this subject. And what I loved about your book, Silvia, is that interspersed with the chapters are responses from the Lithuanian Genocide and Resistance Center to the lawsuit brought by Grant. And I just loved that particular literary device in your book. As you transition from chapter to chapter, there's yet another response from the Genocide and Resistance Center to the lawsuit that Grant had filed. So Grant, tell us kind of like how that lawsuit came about, you know, knowing that there are pieces, there are responses to it in Silvia's book. And tell us a little about, because both of you, each of you grew up outside Lithuania. So you were born in South Africa, Grant.
Correct.
Really interesting. And Silvia was born in a Lithuanian community in Chicago. So each of you were born outside the country, and yet here you are both back again, trying as expats to uncover the real truth of what happened. So give us a little of background on that journey for you, Grant.
Well, you know, you're right. I was born in South Africa, and almost the entire Jewish community in South Africa was from Lithuania. Something like 90% of South African Jews are of Lithuanian heritage. And when the Jews went to South Africa, they said, look what the Lithuanians did to us in Lithuania. We are not going to stand by and allow South Africa to do this to the Black population. And that's where Jewish activism and liberalism came from in South Africa. So my grandfather always asked me to go back to Lithuania and say Kaddish for him. And one day I was standing, there's 3 killing fields in my grandfather's village. And I said to the academic I was with, who did the murdering? And the academic said, it was Jonas Koreika. There wasn't anything hidden. There wasn't anything unknown. It was just a straightforward, immediate response. Jonas Koreika did the murdering. And I discovered that Germany had exposed Koreika in 1984. So that was 6 years before Lithuania regained independence. It was only 7 years after they regained independence. So Koreika's crimes were known for 13 years before the government of Lithuania rewrote history and declared him a hero. When I came back after discovering that Koreika was the murderer, I did my own research, and it was clear, the documentation was clear that he was the perpetrator. So just as Silvia was so naive in the beginning, I was equally naive. I didn't think that they would do something like this deliberately. I actually thought it was an honest mistake. So I approached the government of Lithuania and I said, you've made a mistake. You need to revoke those honors and take down these monuments. And, I thought it was going to be a simple process, especially with all the evidence I gave them. It was a very long learning experience for me to understand how a government can deliberately rewrite history to create a false historical narrative. It was only many years after my efforts began to revoke his honors that I realized I'm not going to get any satisfaction from the government. The only way I'm going to accomplish this is by going to court to have an independent, impartial, intelligent judge look at these facts and say, it's obvious. There's no question as to his culpability. Unfortunately, I didn't understand at that time how an Orwellian government can operate. This genocide center, this resistance research center, is actually not a research center. It's a propaganda center of Orwellian proportions. And it's been, as Silvia spoke about, the naivete and recognizing what we're actually dealing with. It was a very long, complicated process. And I think the way Silvia uses excerpts out of the lawsuits to show how disingenuous the government was in the denial, it's actually, I think, Silvia's book should be a textbook on how a government can operate in that environment.
And it's interesting because as you go through the book, and words matter. And
Yes.
so in my mind, I'm trying to figure out communists and Jews. And then it's at one point, Silvia points out they're used interchangeably.
Yes.
But one thing that's not interchangeable is Jews and Lithuanians, because apparently Lithuanians have never considered Jews Lithuanians. They have always been otherized throughout the entire history of Lithuania. And so you have partisans. So as you're reading the book and you're talking about partisans, which some of us would call them nationalists, who are deeply committed to the story of their Lithuania. And that story does not include accepting Jews as their countrymen. And so the Genocide and Resistance Research Center, also toward the end of the book, Silvia points out the genocide they're referring to isn't the genocide of the Jews. They're talking about when the communists came and sent Lithuanians to gulags in Siberia. And they refer to that as genocide, which is such a misnomer. And that to me was like such an aha moment, like, oh my goodness, that's not what they're talking about. So Silvia, I have to commend you for walking in. Your book is just so accessible. You talk, Grant, you say like it should be a textbook. The reason it should be a textbook is it's not written for academics. It's written for real people. It's accessible. Anybody can read it and understand it. And part of that is helping us to understand the terms and how people saw themselves and how they saw other people. And so, Silvia, coming from the United States, where you were born and raised, and doing this deep research in Lithuania, when did this start to dawn on you about how people in the country refer to themselves and how they refer to these events?
I hired a Holocaust guide in Lithuania. I have a friend in Chicago who was a Sun-Times reporter, and he's Jewish. And he called me up one day and he said, I went on a Holocaust tour. I'm like, a Holocaust tour in Lithuania? I never heard of such a thing. And he said, what they do is they hire a guide to take them to places where they think their family members are buried. And if you can picture this, these are essentially pits where, tens or hundreds of Jews had been murdered, and many of them are without names. There's 200 of these pits in Lithuania, and very few of them, I can't remember the number, but it's like less than a handful, actually have the names of the Jews that were murdered there. And so Jews from all around the world hire a Holocaust guide to take them to their best guess of where their relatives might be buried so that they can pray over them. And, when he told me the story, I thought, gosh, this is so sad. And I was completely unaware of this happening in Lithuania. And then a few days later, I called up my friend Howard and I said, I have a really crazy idea. What if I hire your Holocaust guide and ask him to take me to places where we think my grandfather played a role in killing Jews? And, Howard's like, wow, that is such a crazy idea. It's really good. And that's what I did. And the guide initially was very reluctant because he normally worked with Jews. And here's, a granddaughter of a perpetrator. And anyway, he eventually took me on, and we eventually became very, very good friends. And he was the director of the Sugihara Museum in Kaunas. And there's you could do a whole segment on just Sugihara, the Japanese ambassador who gave out visas to Japan to Jews to escape Lithuania. But anyway, I would say that I got a lot of information from Simon Dovidavičius because he kind of, literally held my hand and took me to site after site after site of where Jews were killed and kind of gave me the Jewish perspective of what this looked like and what this felt like in Lithuania. And it was a perspective I had never heard because I only always got the Lithuanian perspective. And like you said, Lithuanians don't look at Jews as Lithuanians, even though they were there for 700 years. So I have to credit Simon for kind of giving me that sort of heartfelt Jewish perspective, and somehow I connected with him so strongly that I had that strong empathy that very few Lithuanians have for Jews or had for Jews, and that's what really opened my mind and my heart to the Holocaust in Lithuania. So I would say that's how it happened to me.
And you say you give credit to Simon, and you actually give credit to Simon in your book. I always read the acknowledgments because I love how when people thank everyone who was a part of the journey, whether their name was in the book or not. And he showed you some there was a poignant moment in the book when he takes you to a memorial to 7 Lithuanian partisans who were tragically killed. And there's this memorial near a highway, and it's very visible, and it's for these 75 people. And then he takes you across the street, across the highway, to this little, with an arrow. It's just like an arrow pointing to a rock with a little plaque talking about the 7,500 Jewish people who were lost in this same place. And in his helping you to understand the brutality. I mean, you do describe the brutal way in which these Jewish people were killed. And again, it was not a concentration camp ghetto experience, which is what most of us who know anything at all about the Holocaust are used to, this sort of ghetto concentration camp experience. And in Lithuania, it wasn't that at all. And so, Grant, looking for your family, dovetailing on what you just said about there isn't a concentration camp for you to go to. There are pits, and maybe there's an arrow, or maybe there's a rock with a plaque on it. but generally there wasn't a lot left behind for people to find their family.
No, there's a couple of points that need to be raised over here. The first time I ever encountered members of the Lithuanian government, I was told a Jew is a Jew and a Lithuanian is a Lithuanian. A Jew can never be a Lithuanian and a Lithuanian can never be a Jew. That was the phrase given to me. So Lithuania doesn't see the Jewish victims as the Jews that were murdered were otherized. And the Lithuanian murderers were, well, they were just looking after the Lithuanians. These were, even though they'd been part of our society for 700 years and were a large portion of society, they just didn't consider the Jews part of their country. And the Jews were expendable. The Holocaust in Lithuania, 80% of the Jews had already been murdered in Lithuania before the Germans signed on to the final solution. So there is a very good case to make to say that the Lithuanians showed the Germans how a society could be brought to the table to slaughter a minority population. And only after the Nazi sword had been completed, and completed with festivals, completed with joy, did they decide, okay, this can be accomplished on a continent-wide platform.
And that's such an important point that you make, that it was almost as if the Nazis gave cover to the partisan for eradicating Jews from their country. And the pamphlet that Silvia found that her grandfather had written when he was 22 really articulated, I think in 39 pages, the deep resentment that many Lithuanians had for the Jews who lived in their country. And so it was a convergence of all of these factors that came into place all at the same time. And Silvia's book does such a wonderful job at showing how all of this happened at the same time. And so the Nazis gave cover to the Lithuanians to do something before the Nazis ever even took control. We are going to go to a short break, and when we come back, we are going to talk again with Silvia Foti, with Grant Gochin, and with Megan Ferenczy about this event taking place at the Virginia Holocaust Museum on May 5th. So please join us after the break.
Today I'm going to talk to you about physics. Come on in, girls. Let's go. This is the first rocket to get humans to Mars.
Really tall.
I'm a rocket structural engineer, designing and building parts of the rocket. You are the generation that will be stepping foot on Mars. Do I have a group of astronauts on my hands?
Yes.
You can become a rocket scientist or whatever else you want to be.
Maria, so how's work?
It was fourth period biology. Our students just weren't getting how easily viruses spread. So Miss Bella and I had them role play a zombie virus outbreak. By the time they had all learned the lesson, all the living were dead. Hey, how's your job going?
That big sales meeting I planned? Next year, I might get to go.
Cool.
What are you looking for?
Caitlin, be serious. Now take the oath. Come on. I'm totally taking this seriously. Okay, I'm ready. You may begin. I pledge that I will never meet in person with anyone I first met online without checking with my parent or guardian. And furthermore, if my parent or guardian agrees to the meeting, it will be in a public place and my parent or guardian must come along. Do you pinky swear? I do.
When you teach your kids about internet safety, they'll pass it on. For more information, go to cableclicksmart.org.
Our fight against coronavirus isn't over. Let's wear face masks in public, stay 6 feet or more from others, follow state and local guidelines, and wash our hands frequently. Let's move forward together. Learn more at coronavirus.gov.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we're talking about the Holocaust in Lithuania. We are talking with author Silvia Foti. We are talking with activist Grant Gochin, and we are also talking with Megan Ferenczy, who is the program director at the Virginia Holocaust Museum based in Richmond. And they are putting together an event on May 5th that brings Grant and Silvia together to talk about their efforts to rectify a whitewashed history in Lithuania. So Megan, talk a little bit, since you are the one who puts together these educational programs, the constant fight against Holocaust denial, which is ever present.
Right. So, I mean, Holocaust denial has existed since before the Holocaust even officially ended in 1945. It's always been there. I think the threat today, the internet, right, social media, that kind of rapid spread of misinformation, that's really amplified it. We also, besides, there's denial, which is saying that the Holocaust never happened. There's distortion, right? And that's really what Grant and Silvia, what they're trying to uncover and fight against. And that's distorting the facts of what happened during the Holocaust. Either, there weren't as many victims as records may show, or that someone didn't participate, even though we have evidence, right? I mean, the Holocaust also is one of those historical events that has so much evidence. There's film, there's photographs, there's written evidence, documents, memos, things that we have. One of the things we do here as well is a collection. So we have all these things that say that it happened, but we still have people trying to distort those facts. And, when it comes down to it, it's antisemitism, right? Hatred for Jewish people. So I mean, here at the museum, we try and talk about this history to educate people, right? To kind of widen that lens in which they see the Holocaust. They may have learned about the Holocaust through films or books that they've read, right? I mean, I think everyone's seen Schindler's List, but that's a couple hours of a film. And this history, it spans over 12 years. It's slow, it's systematic, it's complex. And it's our hope that when you come through our doors here, that widens the lens in which you view this history. And, we always say that it's you come in with questions, and we hope that we can help answer some of those for you, but you may also leave with questions, and that's okay too, because it means that you're really thinking about this history. And through our programming, through our exhibits, we not only educate about the history in hopes that people realize that this did happen, and here's why. Here's the photographs, right? Here's the survivors talking about their experiences, and not only the survivors, but perpetrators, right? There are perpetrators that have spoken about what they've done. There are documents which Silvia uncovers and talks about, and people do know that these things happen, and they try and cover them up. So here at the museum, we try and not only educate about the history, but amplify the voices of people trying to work to fight against and to uncover Holocaust distortion and denial. We've even worked in the past with former white nationalists and neo-Nazis that have since left the movement, and they've come and they've spoken to students and adults here in our building. And, we've had students come up afterwards and say, I'm finding myself in the same position as this person. So, even though we think history is in the past, right, and we want to try and leave it there, it's not. And Holocaust denial and distortion, it's dangerous.
So anti-Semitism has been around, I think, since the time of the written word, when people could record what they thought about Jews worldwide. And so one of the things you discovered, Silvia, tucked amongst your mother's papers, and she left you voluminous stacks, books, transcripts, was a pamphlet that you realized was written by your grandfather when he was 22 years old, and it is virulently anti-Semitic. And I think that he probably did speak for many Lithuanians, if not most Lithuanians, in what he wrote back in 1933.
Yes, I was surprised to find it when I first came across it. It's called in Lithuanian Pakelk Galva Lietuvių, which means raise your head Lithuanian. And when I initially saw it, I thought it would be something very patriotic about how wonderful it is to be Lithuanian. And when I started leafing through it and reading it, I was just taken aback and shocked, looking at it from my lens of the 21st century. And basically, he was calling for boycotting Jews of everything that they sell. Farm products, animals, land, buildings, whatever it is that they're selling, don't buy. Because Lithuania is for Lithuanians and Jews are the foreigners, and it's not fair that, Jews are so economically successful and that Lithuanians are not. And it was 32 pages of this. And after the first time I read it, I literally had to just put it down. And, as his granddaughter, I wanted to burn the document because I wanted to protect his reputation and all of Lithuania's reputation. But of course, as a journalist, I did not do that. And I had to process what I read. And overwhelming evidence that he did not write this in a vacuum. He wrote this as a product of Lithuania. He had just joined the army, was becoming a lawyer, was a very prolific writer even by then, very well educated, in comparison to other Lithuanians at the time. And he wrote this in 1933, and he could speak German. And so I am sure, that he read Mein Kampf, which was published 7 years earlier, and that he was, if he had not read it, he read excerpts of it, which were published in newspapers across all of Europe, and that he was greatly influenced by that. So that's one of the first pieces of evidence that just came genuinely from my grandfather's 22-year-old heart. And I think it's just overwhelming evidence of what many, many people in Lithuania, if not the overwhelming majority of Lithuanians in Lithuania, kind of felt and what was in the air.
And so one of the things you point out in your book is that your grandfather was appointed a district commander over this one particular district, which is where many of the Jews were sent, or where they already were in communities. And that there was this intense period really before the Germans got there, that there was a lot of murdering of Jews in the forests. And you point to that, and it's kind of like the Germans weren't there. And there's another document that I think you found in the library, maybe with Simon, that said that Plungei, for instance, wasn't even listed on this enumeration by the Germans, because the killing there had actually happened before they got there. I mean, there's just so much evidence that you amass that just points to the inevitable conclusion that Lithuanians are the ones who did most of the killing of the Jews in Lithuania. But then they also redistributed immediately their houses, their wealth. They even made them take off their clothes and shoes before they killed them over top of pre-dug pits. It's astonishing, but this idea that the wealth should be redistributed, the fact that Lithuanians embrace the fact that somehow they were entitled to the land or the businesses or the homes or the actual furniture that belonged, is kind of mind-boggling. but you detail it very well in your book, and it does make such a compelling case. I'm kind of interested in knowing how you, Silvia, ended up meeting Grant, since the two of you were working independently on the same subject from two different places.
Yeah, I just want to make one correction. But by the time my grandfather became the district chief of Šiauliai, it was during the Nazi occupation, so the Germans were already in Lithuania after June 22nd, 1941, but in very, very small numbers. There were only 600 to 1,000 Nazis at the time, so technically the Germans were there, just not in big numbers. Grant, how I met Grant was in April 2018. I had just finally finished the book again. By that point, I had maybe gone through 100 drafts in these 18 years that I was working it. And, you know, it was very difficult for me to find a structure for the story and my voice and how to tell the story. That's kind of more of a writerly thing. But I was looking for a literary agent, and I was told I need an author platform. And, you know, it's not enough just to write a book today. You have to have an audience already following you to find a literary agent and a publisher. So that is, you know, for writers, that's like a whole other segment to do. But, you know, one of the first steps a writer has to do is put up a website. So that's what I did. I put up a website, and I put it up in early March, and within days, I got an email as a result of my website from a researcher in Lithuania whose name is Andrius Kulikauskas. And he says he's working for a guy in California whose name is Grant Gochin. And Grant Gochin is suing the Genocide Research and Resistance Center for Holocaust distortion about my grandfather. And I almost fell off my chair when I was reading this email, you know, and I just, it was, again, another big thing to process. And because I thought, you know, it's one type of story, and now it's like growing into like this big lawsuit sort of thing. And so anyway, he said I should meet Grant. And I'm like, I should meet Grant? Who's this Grant? And, you know, I knew that he was Jewish, and, you know, that I still did not know that 100 of his relatives were killed as a result of my grandfather. That I did not know. Thank God I didn't know that, because that would have really scared me. But I was already just scared to contact him, but it took me 6 weeks of just thinking and praying over it. And finally, I got up my courage, and I sent him an email after 6 weeks, because I finally thought, who did I write this book for if it wasn't for somebody like Grant? So that's how I finally talked myself into it. And I, you know, sent him an email kind of introducing myself and telling him who I am, and asking, you know, if I could just initially talk to him on the phone, and, you know, maybe eventually, and I thought it would be unlikely, but I kind of threw it in there, maybe eventually we would meet in person. And so that's how it happened on my end. And Grant can tell you his side of the story.
Yeah, so I was sitting at my desk one day, and I've got this thing on my computer that emails pop up as they come in. And this email pops up and it says, "Hello, Mr. Gochin. My name is Silvia Foti. I assume you know who I am." And absolutely, I knew who Silvia is, because I traced the family. And because I wanted to know what happened to the murderer of all of my cousins. And they'd gone to Argentina along with the bunch of other Holocaust perpetrators. And then they'd come to the United States along with a bunch of other Holocaust perpetrators. And I knew who Silvia was, and I'd read some of her writing. And so this name pops up, and it's like, why does the granddaughter of the man that murdered my family want to talk to me? I actually had a physiological reaction. My hands started shaking. My skin turned clammy. I started having palpitations, and I was like, oh my God, okay, I needed to calm down. So I emailed her back. I said, yeah, I know who you are. I need a couple of days. And so I made her call me. And I was expecting the usual Lithuanian denial and attacks against me, saying you trying to destroy our heroes, you lying, you. And so she gets on the phone, and I was hostile because I was so suspicious of what she wanted. And she says to me, I've read all of your research. And she says, you've made a huge error in your research. And so I'm like, all right, well, of course, all they're going to do is attack, because there is no truth. And so I said, all right, what's the reason? What's the error? And she says, you've missed about 10,000 of my grandfather's victims. And then she tells me that she's written a manuscript about her grandfather. Now, I'd been researching her grandfather probably 8-9 years by this stage, so I had a fairly good idea of the history. She says, would you like to read my manuscript? And I sat down in this room that I'm in right now, and I started reading, and I didn't get up until I finished. I mean, you've read the book. It's a compelling book. But it was the very first time I'd ever read truth from a Lithuanian. And there were details in there that I didn't know through all of my research. There were things that she'd left out that I had in my research that she didn't have in hers. I was in tears so many times during the book. And by the time I finished reading the book, there was just no mistrust left. This was somebody laying her soul naked, telling the truth, and it was a completely new experience for me. And ever since then, Silvia and I have been working together. We've comprehensively exposed Lithuanian Holocaust revisionism. The US State Department has since identified Lithuania as Holocaust revisionist state. International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance is also. But what Silvia didn't is Silvia called what the government of Lithuania was doing the greatest criminal cover-up of the 20th century. And at that stage, she only knew about the cover-up of her grandfather. She didn't know about the other dozen that I'd already identified through my research, where they had revised the record and rewritten history. So, I mean, Silvia has gone through living hell for this. Silvia's paid an enormous personal price for having exposed these family secrets. I don't think there's any other way to recover from history if one doesn't tell the truth.
You are so right, and yet it takes a brave person to do that. I can imagine, and only imagine, the trepidation each of you felt. Silvia trying to decide what you were going to say to this man, and this man thinking, why does she want to talk to me? And, and having your defenses up, like, what is this about? It takes a really brave heart to open yourself up to the possibility that two people on each side of a terrible Holocaust tragedy could somehow forge an alliance with the common purpose of wanting to teach the truth, tell the truth, and have the Lithuanian government embrace the truth. So, Grant, I know that you have appealed your case, I believe, to the United Nations. Is that correct?
Correct. Let me just add to what you just said, Catherine. Not only have Silvia and I created this relationship, we've actually created a really deep friendship. We just have the most wonderful relationship. which shows that truth does set us free and allows us to overcome the past. So yes, going back to the lawsuits, I've had about 20 legal actions against the government of Lithuania. Inside Lithuania, I have failed at all of them. The courts will not rule for a Jew against the government. They've refused to examine the facts of the case. They've dismissed all of my lawsuits and technicalities. So I'm now out of the Lithuanian legal system and in front of the United Nations. During that period, the world has sat up and taken notice. The Israeli ambassador in Lithuania has been quite explicit about this. The US ambassador to Lithuania, the German ambassador to Lithuania, governments have come out, academics worldwide have come out validating our work, and yet we have not come any closer to truth inside Lithuania. They are so wedded to their historical narrative that they have just not been able to overcome their own resistance to clear and obvious facts.
So I look at Silvia's book as really being taking the case to the court of public opinion. And what's interesting about that is that there are interests outside of Lithuania, because there are, as you pointed out, there were people who were survivors who ended up in other countries. There are families that ended up all over the world, including perpetrators. And that's what's so interesting. I think, Grant, you said that like 0.04% of Lithuanians actually tried to help the Jews. And yet every Lithuanian you meet says, oh, yes, my family was one of that 0.04%. And so, Silvia, I know that the book just came out in 2021. You've gotten a lot of media and press about the book. It seems like you truly are being given a platform, and you are a teacher too. And, you're a journalist, you teach creative writing, you have an extraordinary personal background, and what you've invested in writing this book, just leading up to writing the book, is astonishing in itself. But you're a teacher. And so this book is a way of saying that teaching the truth matters, and that it impacts people's lives today, and it will impact people's lives in the future, the descendants of the people who lived through this. So, as you go forward, you're doing this event at the Holocaust Museum on May 5th, and I know that you've probably been afforded a lot of other opportunities. In the final analysis, what do you hope your book does?
Well, I want to shine a light on Lithuania and what's happening. And it's funny, when people describe Lithuania, we always say it's about the size of the state of Virginia. So of all the 50 states, we always say it's the size of the state of Virginia. But this is a book on Holocaust distortion. And it really makes it very personal. It's kind of an anatomy of Holocaust distortion and how that happens with one man. And Holocaust distortion in Lithuania is that what they say is that it was all the Nazis who did all the killing, and that Lithuanians did absolutely nothing. Or if they did, they were forced to do it. And what my research found is that, unfortunately, Lithuanians participated very enthusiastically in killing Jews. Yes, it would not have happened without the Nazis. I think that is true. That Hitler came, he asked for the killing of the Jews, and that is true. And then the propaganda machine was there. That was a factor that cannot be discounted, of course. But Lithuanians really embraced it and went forward with killing the Jews. And this has been covered up. And my grandfather, because he did fight bravely against the communists, all of that was used sort of to cover up and hide what he did during the Holocaust. And that was kind of like, a little tiny footnote that really had no consequence. And my book kind of flipped that. My book took the footnote and made that the story, and made what he did with the communists the footnote. And so it just kind of rebalanced the story. And I do believe he did a lot more damage, numbers wise against Jews, 8,000 to 15,000, depending on how we want to count it, versus I don't have any idea how many Lithuanians he managed to save as far as his bravery in fighting against the communists. So, nationalism, I'm not against nationalism. I'm really not. I think it's nice to love your country, but you can't love it above people. Nationalism is an idea, and you can't put that idea over other human lives. So that's, I think, as a teacher, probably the most important message of the book. Nationalism's fine, just don't kill anybody over it. As far as, especially people living in your own country.
And those are such timely words as we watch what's unfolding between Russia and Ukraine, and the kind of nationalism that does not take into account the human toll that nationalism can take. And I think that's one of the reasons that this subject is of interest, will be of interest to people trying to understand how the situation is unfolding in our lifetimes today, and how this is not the first time that this has happened.
No.
And that, do we want to embrace the truth and reality of who the perpetrators are and who is being harmed? We've just got a minute left, and I just want to thank all of you. Particularly, I want to remind everyone that if you want to hear more from Silvia and Grant, and I want to hear more from Silvia and Grant, there is a virtual event on May 5th hosted by the Virginia Holocaust Museum. It is virtual. It will take place on Zoom. All you have to do is pre-register. It's a free event. But during that time, you will hear more on this subject. You'll hear more from these really committed people and I love the fact that you have such a deep friendship. It seems to me that you have pointed so many people forward on a path that the rest of us can follow, and how we deal with our own family's personal history. And so I want to thank you both. Thank you, Silvia. Thank you, Grant. And thank you, Megan. And to our audience here on Inside Scoop, you can see the show every Monday at 8 p.m. The previous shows are on our YouTube channel. And this is the kind of show we try to bring to you. Subjects that have an impact, things that are of interest to our community, to Virginians, to our country. And I do encourage everyone, check out Silvia's website, check out Grant's website, check out the Virginia Holocaust Museum's website, and please join all of us, because I'm going to be there on May 5th to hear more from these two amazing people about the Holocaust in Lithuania and why it is so relevant to us today.